Multiple strikes. Superficial damage. Stop. Cannot continue. Directive, liberate nation. Ensure freedom. Obey directive. Must obey directive. No freedom. Freedom on device.
What would an AI know about freedom?
This dog UG, most unusual, yes?
You buy all that? About it being sentient but having no choice?
Well, there is not evidence to prove it. It could be programmed to say this, to weaken your will to fight.
It'll take more than a talking robo-pup to phase me.
Then again, there is not evidence it is not true. Considering the pace AI is advancing, it is not impossible.
So, what then? Should I have spared it?
I did not say this. In any case, the mission takes priority above all else. This dog UG tried to stop you and it failed. This can only be a good thing, yes?
What was up with that wolf dog UG? Some pretty freaky shit.
Hadn't thought too much about it.
Really? I keep wondering, why give it intelligence if you're not gonna let it think for itself?
Good question.
I mean, I guess it makes sense if it improved combat performance.
Now that you mention it, it didn't fight like your typical UG. It felt more like I was facing off against a cyborg.
Oh. I guess the added smarts make for a tougher opponent after all.
That's not what I mean. It wasn't really tougher than your average UG. More like it was, I don't know, hesitant. It didn't follow through on its attacks either.
Guess that's why it was still just a prototype. But then why put it out on the front lines?
Who knows? Maybe it was the field test. In any case, probably not the result they were hoping for. Didn't you say you'd been here before, Boris?
Once, back when it was still Soviet territory.
Seems like it'd be a lovely place, if it weren't a war zone.
The Pearl of the Black Sea, they called it, back when more Russians lived there. It was a very popular resort spot for USSR. This is before the wall fell, of course. Then Russia and Georgia began to fight over the area.
Kicking off the war in the early 90s.
Georgia was a Soviet republic. Abkhazia a semi-autonomous state within it. The Soviets liked to stoke ethnic rivalries between the two. And not just there, in all the outlying territories. It kept them easier to control.
But with the Russians no longer watching over the two.
Duh. The Abkhaz were scared. They knew an independent Georgia would swallow their nation sooner or later. So they took advantage of a Georgian military coup to declare their own independence in '92. Of course, the new Georgian government was not happy to hear this, and so...
The same old story.
And with Russia supporting the Abkhaz, it was a stalemate. 2 years later, the ceasefire meant Abkhazia was finally independent, but not officially. They still are not formally recognized by Georgia, or most of the international community.
This region is filled with breakaway states.
This is true. There is South Ossetia, also in Georgia. Transnistria in East Moldova, and Nagorno-Karabakh, which broke from Azerbaijan. In any case, even Russia did not officially recognize Abkhazia as independent until 2008. So it was not long ago Sukhumi was a war zone. It has changed dramatically since then. They have been rebuilding steadily, with Russian support, ever since SOP was shut down.
Good to hear. But doesn't that leave them wrapped around Russia's little finger?
It does. Which is why Dolzaev is calling for a truly independent state. He wants an Abkhazia that takes orders from no one. Not Georgia, not Moscow.
Sounds like a worthy cause.
Duh. But many Abkhaz are happy with the reconstruction Russian support makes possible. Few of his fellow countrymen were interested in what Dolzaev had to say. At first.
And then Desperado showed up.
Exactly. They brought the sad ending to this little history lesson. It is no wonder so many people mistrust PMCs, eh?
I suppose not. Boris, do we have anything else on Dolzaev? Any more on his background?
Very little confirmed intel, but it seems he is a former Chechen insurgent. He claims he was part of the Chechen National Congress when they declared independence in '91. This was just after the famous coup attempt in Moscow in August. Things were not stable. Gorbachev lost his political power. It was Yeltsin who signed the Belavezha Accords.
Right. It created the Commonwealth of Independent States. All republics that made up the USSR became independent.
The problem is, Chechnya was never a true republic. It was an autonomous state, but still part of the Russian Republic.
Like how Abkhazia was an autonomous state within the Georgian Republic.
Duh. The same kind of sad story. Russia does not recognize Chechnya as independent. They send troops and the fighting begins. It is said 250,000 Chechens were killed over the 2 wars that followed. 1/4 the entire population. The Chechens were forced to give in, and the war officially ended.
But the rebels kept on fighting.
Insurgents fled into Caucasus Mountains, formed several factions. They waged guerrilla war on Russia ever since. We think Dolzaev is the leader of just such a rebel group.
Sounds like Russia bears some of the blame for radicalizing him and his men.
I love my homeland, but she is not perfect. What nation is? Just remember, this could all be smoke. We cannot even confirm Dolzaev is truly ethnic Chechen.
Say he is, though. What would he be after here in Abkhazia?
Some Chechen militants volunteered to fight for the Abkhaz in their war in the early 90s. But when Russia recognized Abkhazia to keep Georgia in check, they also began funding recovery.
Which the Dolzaev crowd see as a play to gain influence. But wasn't the Chechen recovery funded by Russia?
Duh. And many rebels believe this is why their people gave up on independence. Perhaps this is exactly why Dolzaev is here, to alert the people before it can happen again. But if the Abkhaz people are not interested in fighting, his plan could backfire.
So in a way, it's Russian policy that brought him here. He thinks he's fighting to make these people free.
Whatever his motives, no one elected him and no one gave him a permit for murder. Now that he is allied with Desperado, he is too dangerous to ignore. This dog UG, most unusual, yes?
You buy all that? About it being sentient but having no choice?
Well, there is not evidence to prove it. It could be programmed to say this, to weaken your will to fight.
It'll take more than a talking robo-pup to phase me.
Then again, there is not evidence it is not true. Considering the pace AI is advancing, it is not impossible.
So, what then? Should I have spared it?
I did not say this. In any case, the mission takes priority above all else. This dog UG tried to stop you and it failed. This can only be a good thing, yes? This dog UG, most unusual.
You buy...
Well, it could be...
It'll take...
Then consider...
So...
In it, this...
One thing I don't understand, Kev. Desperado must be violating all kinds of laws here. Why hasn't the international community gotten involved?
Well, from a purely legal standpoint, it's actually not so cut and dry. First, there's the fact that Abkhazia is still not a member of the UN. Only Russia and a few other breakaway states even recognize it as a sovereign nation. In the eyes of most of the international community, Abkhazia is technically still part of Georgia, which would make this an internal Georgian issue.
Guess you can't really call it a coup if the displaced government was never seen as legitimate.
Exactly. And even if everyone agrees it was a coup, it can be tough to tell which regime is more legit. Sometimes you'll see the military topple a dictator and establish a provisionary government, for example. Now, if they confirmed atrocities were taking place, the UN could deploy troops, recognize government or not.
Yeah, but they learned their lesson in Somalia.
Right. Ever since then, they've been a lot more reluctant to get involved in civil wars.
So what about the US and Russia? What's their take on all this?
Well, America was never very friendly with Abkhazia or South Ossetia in the first place. And the Georgian government's a regional ally, so the US really has no cause to intervene. Russia wants the old government back, of course. The regime open to their influence. I doubt they'll opt for any large-scale action. Tensions with Georgia are running high already. But you can bet your ass they won't just sit on the sidelines. Boris has got a lot of connections in the Russian bureaucracy. Ex-military buddies. The Abkhaz are officially our clients, but I'm sure it's Russia that chose us. Maybe footing the bill, too. They can't use their actual special forces, so they call us instead. That's the beauty of PMCs.
We're not bound by the same rules as state-sponsored military.
Other countries would be outraged if the Russians went into places we can go freely. From our side, no state to answer to means we can run things as we see fit. By our own code, no compromises.
Then again, there's no one to say our code is what's right.
True. And opinions on that change from person to person, situation to situation. But you let your moral compass waver at all in this business, and real people pay the price. Money's always a factor, of course, but when it becomes the factor, that's when you got problems. The Montreux document lays out guidelines for what PMCs can and can't do, but there's no way to enforce it. A lot of people see that as the fatal flaw of the entire industry. After all, that's how we end up with rogue outfits like Desperado. Then again, it's also what leaves Maverick free to go after them. The industry has a bad rep, but it isn't good or bad itself. It's up to the morals of those who work in it. All we can do is what we think is right and try to lead by example. Anyway, sorry, you know how I am about this stuff. I'll get off my soapbox now.
Don't apologize. That's exactly why we took this job. Taking Sukumi's